have the ability to memorize that and be able to recite it verbatim.
As the catalogue of revelations grew, Muhammad continued to preach on the streets of Mecca, gradually gathering a group of converts around him. His followers came to be known as Muslims, meaning those who submit to God. Muhammad's message appealed especially to the town's poor and underprivileged, who heard their own lives echoed in the verses' pleas for social justice, that slaves should be freed, and that the rich and powerful should give charity to the needy. Some converts to the Quran were entranced by the sheer beauty of the language of the work itself, which they saw as so perfect it had to be the work of God.
When Muslims are asked, well, all right, what proof have you got that this is a divine revelation? Muslims will answer, and they have answered this over 1,000 years, the proof is the Quran itself. That is the miracle, that an illiterate man in the middle of nowhere suddenly produces this magnificent, powerful document.
But some men were distinctly unimpressed by Muhammad. His provocative statements, which refused to recognize the divinity of the idols housed in the Kaaba, infuriated the ruling Quraysh tribe and threatened its position of power.
And if you needed nothing to stand between you and this God, then there's no reason for the idols. And if there's no reason for the idols, then there's no reason for the Kaaba. And if there's no reason for the Kaaba, then there's no reason for Mecca's ascendancy as this social and economic capital of the Arabian Peninsula. So the conflict that the Quraysh had with Muhammad and these revelations was not a theological conflict. It was an economic conflict. It was a political conflict.
The Quraysh and the majority of Meccans showed scant tolerance for the several dozen followers of Muhammad. The Muslims were persecuted. Some were beaten in the streets, others were tortured. For 9 years, the new believers endured the abuse, never wavering from their conviction that there was no God but God. Muhammad himself was protected by his wealthy wife and his powerful uncle, but when they died, the Prophet and his followers realized they had no choice but to leave Mecca.
The social fabric had been so shredded to the point that he did not feel that he would be able to physically continue in his mission in Mecca, and that he would have to begin to search for some kind of alternative base of operation.
The new base would see a new stream of doctrine injected into the Quran, a greater emphasis on law, and a doctrine for war. For 12 years, beginning in 610 AD, the Prophet Muhammad received God's revelation from the angel Gabriel, and he preached it to the inhabitants of Mecca. But life for Muhammad's growing group of disciples became increasingly dangerous there. The city elders rejected the Muslim advocacy of its belief in one God, viciously persecuted the adherents of monotheism, and put a price on the Prophet's head. But then, in the year 622, Muhammad's fortunes turned around.
A group of people from a neighboring oasis came to Mecca looking for someone to arbitrate a dispute they were having. Muhammad, as a prophet, was considered to be an ideal person for this job. And eventually they agreed to take in not only Muhammad and his family, but also a whole group of these Muslims.
Gradually, clandestinely, the small Muslim community made its way 250 miles north to Yathrib, a city which, from that point on, would be called Medina, the city of the Prophet. The new location brought a new position for Muhammad.
Whereas at one point he was a prophet, merely the conduit of God's words flowing through him, in Medina, he becomes a leader. His community of Muslims is part of that leadership, but also he is understood to have then an authority over the entire oasis of Medina.
In Medina, the Prophet continued to offer revelations to his followers, but the nature of these verses was noticeably different. According to Muslim historians, they began to reflect Muhammad's status as a leader and added a new element to the overall canon, transforming it into a practical guide to creating and administering society.
The verses are basically about a society that needs regulation. And therefore, the most striking thing about the Medinan period is the laws, or practically all of the legislation that the Quran includes comes from the Medinan period.
The revelations traditionally associated with the Medina period laid the foundations of Islamic law. They included rules covering most aspects of life, from the prohibition of alcohol to the permission to mothers to breastfeed their babies for up to 2 years. The verses provided guidelines for inheritance and legacies, gave new rights to dispossessed persons such as orphans and slaves, and set new rules elevating the position of women in society. But the meaning of some of these laws was not always clear, and many are still debated to this day. A prime example is whether or not the Quran allows polygamy. Marry those women who are lawful for you, up to 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you cannot be equitable, then only 1. Chapter 4, verse 3. At first glance, the verse seems straightforward enough, but Islamic scholars point out that it can be interpreted in different ways.
Some say this means you can have 4 wives. Some say it only means you can have 1 because you can never treat more than one person equally with another person. Some say that it refers only to a very specific situation when there were a lot of orphaned girls available, and the implication was, well, you got to take care of these orphans. So we have to realize that it's not always easy to read out of the text exactly what the implications are for our time, or for any time.
Inspired by the Quran's teaching and Muhammad's charismatic leadership, all Medina converted to Islam. The instructions handed down to the Prophet became the laws of the city.
It was a community that was run by this revelation that was constantly coming forth from Muhammad's mouth. This was a living, breathing, constantly evolving revelation.
The revelations soon gave the Muslims permission to take up arms as a means of survival. The authorities in Mecca still maintained a bounty on the Prophet's head for preaching against their religious practices and threatening the fabric of their economy. And they were not minded to tolerate Muhammad's new role as head of state in Medina. In the year 622, Mecca declared war on Muhammad and his followers in Medina. Just as the Quran had given them laws when the community needed order, at this crucial moment, it gave them permission to defend themselves against their attackers when they were under threat. And fight for the cause of God, those who fight you. But do not be aggressive. Surely God does not like the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them and drive them out, from wherever they drove you out. Chapter 2, verse 190. Today, these verses, known as the sword verses, constitute some of the most striking and controversial passages in the Quran. Those who argue that the Quran condones or even promotes violence quote these verses to support their claims. But the lines are more complex than simple battle cries.
The Quran says, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Well, this is within a context in which the Muslims are under siege, they have enemies, and the Quran is saying, you know, fight your enemies. You have a right to fight the enemies of God. The Quran also says, when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is